Hi friends, welcome back to Talevora. Adolf Hitler's rise from an unknown young man to the leader of Nazi Germany changed the course of modern history. His story is not only about one person, but about a country facing political and economic crisis, a movement built on extreme ideology, and the decisions that eventually led to World War II and unimaginable destruction across Europe. In this story, we'll follow how Hitler rose to power, how Nazi Germany transformed, and how his actions changed the world forever. Adolf Hitler's story began on April 20, 1889. In Braunehmen, a small town in Austria-Hungary. He was born into a middle-class family, and his father, Alois Hitler, worked as a customs official. His mother, Clara, was deeply devoted to her children. From an early age, Adolf developed a strong interest in drawing and art, and he imagined that one day he would become an artist. His relationship with his father was difficult. Alois wanted his son to follow a more conventional career, while Adolf wanted to pursue his own interests. Their disagreements created tension inside the family. When Adolf was still a teenager, his father died in 1903. A few years later, another major loss changed his life when his mother died in 1907. Hitler was 19 years old and suddenly had to face adulthood without the two people who had shaped his early life. He moved to Vienna with the ambition of becoming an artist. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, hoping to study painting, but he was rejected. He tried again and was rejected a second time. The failure deeply affected him. Instead of finding a stable career, he struggled financially and spent periods living in cheap accommodation. During his years in Vienna, Hitler encountered the intense political and ethnic tensions that existed in the city. Vienna was home to people from many different backgrounds, and political movements competed for influence. Hitler became increasingly interested in nationalist and anti-Semitic ideas that were circulating in European politics at the time. These ideas did not originate with him, but they became increasingly important to the worldview he later developed. In 1913, Hitler left Austria and moved to Munich, Germany. He was still relatively unknown and had no clear path to political power. Then Europe entered one of the most devastating periods in its history. In 1914, World War I began. Hitler joined the German army and served as a dispatch runner on the Western Front. He experienced the realities of modern warfare firsthand. He was exposed to artillery attacks, death, injuries, exhaustion, and the destruction of the battlefield. He was awarded the Iron Cross for his service, but the war left a deep impression on him. In 1918, Germany was defeated. The German Empire collapsed, and the country entered a period of political and economic uncertainty. Hitler was devastated by the defeat. Like many Germans at the time, he struggled to understand how Germany had gone from a powerful empire to a defeated nation. Germany was facing enormous problems. The monarchy had fallen. The new democratic government was struggling to establish itself, and political violence was spreading. The Treaty of Versailles imposed severe conditions on Germany, including territorial losses, military restrictions, and financial obligations. Many Germans felt humiliated by the settlement. Inflation, unemployment, political violence, and social instability created an atmosphere in which extremist movements could gain attention. Hitler remained in the army after the war and was assigned to observe political groups in Munich. In 1919, he attended a meeting of a small political organization called the German Workers' Party. The group was nationalist and strongly opposed to communism and the post-war political system. Hitler was impressed by the political atmosphere of the organization and soon became one of its most active members. His ability to speak passionately in front of crowds quickly became noticeable. He could take people's anger, fears, and frustrations and turned them into powerful political messages. The German Workers' Party eventually became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. Hitler began building the party's identity around extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, opposition to communism, and the promise of restoring German strength. He understood the importance of mass communication. The party used speeches, posters, symbols, uniforms, rallies, and carefully organized public events to attract attention. Hitler himself became the central figure of the movement. His speeches were emotional and theatrical, designed to make audiences feel that Germany was facing an existential crisis and that only radical political change could save the country. But Hitler's rise was not inevitable. At this stage, the Nazi Party was still a relatively small political organization competing with many other groups. In 1923, Hitler decided to attempt a direct seizure of power. Inspired partly by Benito Mussolini's recent rise in Italy, Hitler and his supporters attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The attempt failed. Hitler was arrested and put on trial. The failed coup could have ended his political career. Instead, it gave him national publicity. During his trial, Hitler used the courtroom as another platform to present his political ideas. He was sentenced to prison but served only a relatively short period. While imprisoned at Landsberg, he dictated the book that became known as Mein Kampf. In it, he described his political worldview, his extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, territorial ambitions, and ideas about race. The book later became an important source for understanding the ideology of the Nazi movement. After leaving prison, Hitler changed his strategy. He realized that taking power through an immediate violent uprising was unlikely to succeed. Instead, the Nazis would attempt to gain power through the existing political system while simultaneously undermining democratic institutions. The years that followed were a period of rebuilding. The Nazi Party expanded its organization across Germany. Local branches were established, propaganda became more sophisticated, and Hitler developed a political machine designed to reach millions of people. But for several years, the Nazis remained a relatively minor political force. Their breakthrough came when Germany entered another severe crisis. The global economic crash of 1929 devastated the German economy. Businesses collapsed, unemployment increased dramatically, and millions of ordinary people became frightened about their future. Confidence in Germany's democratic government weakened. Political parties on both the extreme left and extreme right gained support. Hitler presented himself as a leader who could restore order, national pride, employment, and German power. The Nazi message became increasingly attractive to people who were desperate for change. As the political crisis deepened, the Nazi Party's support grew rapidly. Hitler was no longer the obscure political agitator who had failed in Munich. He was becoming one of the most important political figures in Germany. But the final step toward power would come through a combination of elections, political deals, elite miscalculations, and the weakness of Germany's democratic system. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He had finally reached the position from which he could begin transforming the country according to his ideology. What happened next would change Germany, Europe, and the entire world. After Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, his position was still not completely secure. Germany was technically a constitutional state, and Hitler had been appointed through the existing political system. But within months, he began dismantling that system from the inside. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 created an atmosphere of fear and emergency. Hitler's government used the crisis to restrict civil liberties and and target political opponents, particularly communists. Soon afterward, the Enabling Act gave Hitler's government the power to pass laws without normal parliamentary approval. The democratic system was rapidly losing its ability to resist him. Political opposition was crushed. Communist and socialist organizations were targeted. Independent trade unions were dissolved, and opponents of the Nazi regime were arrested. Germany was being transformed into a one-party dictatorship. Hitler also moved to eliminate potential rivals within his own movement. In June 1934, during what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, members of the Nazi leadership and other political opponents were arrested and killed. The purge strengthened Hitler's control over the Nazi Party and reassured important military and conservative figures that he intended to maintain order on his terms. When President Paul von Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler combined the positions of president and chancellor and declared himself Führer. The German armed forces were required to swear an oath of personal loyalty to him. Hitler now had enormous political power, but controlling Germany was only one part of his vision. He wanted to transform German society according to Nazi racial ideology. The regime divided people into categories based on race and ancestry and treated Jews as enemies of the German nation. Anti-Semitism became official government policy. Jewish people were gradually excluded from public life, universities, professions, businesses, and other areas of society. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of citizenship and prohibited marriages between Jews and people classified as German or related blood. Discrimination was becoming institutionalized. Propaganda played a central role in this transformation. Newspapers, radio, films, schools, public ceremonies, and enormous political rallies were placed under increasing state control. Hitler's image appeared everywhere. The regime presented him as the leader who had supposedly rescued Germany from humiliation and economic collapse. Young people were also targeted. Nazi organizations sought to shape the beliefs and behavior of children and teenagers. Education was increasingly influenced by Nazi ideology, and participation in youth organizations became an important part of growing up under the dictatorship. At the same time, Hitler began rebuilding Germany's military strength in violation of the restrictions imposed after World War I. He introduced conscription and expanded the armed forces. German troops were sent into the Rhineland in 1936, a region where Germany had previously been restricted from maintaining military forces. The move was a major gamble. If Britain or France had responded militarily, Hitler might have been forced to withdraw. They did not. The success strengthened Hitler's confidence and convinced many Germans that he was restoring their country's power. Hitler then turned his attention toward territorial expansion. In 1938, German troops entered Austria, and Austria was incorporated into Nazi Germany in the Anschluss. The event was welcomed by many Austrians, although opposition and coercion also existed, and the Nazi regime quickly extended its policies into the country. Hitler's next major target was Czechoslovakia. He demanded the Sudetenland, an area containing many German-speaking inhabitants. Britain and France tried to avoid another major European war and negotiated with Hitler. The result was the Munich Agreement of September 1938, which allowed Germany to take the Sudetenland. Hitler presented the agreement as a victory, but within months German forces occupied the remaining Czech lands. The expansion was no longer simply about uniting Germany German-speaking populations. Hitler was pursuing a much broader territorial project. Behind these political moves was an ideological belief that Germany needed additional territory for its future. Eastern Europe became central to his plans. Poland was next. Hitler demanded the return of territory and access that Germany had lost after World War I. Poland refused. Meanwhile, Europe was becoming increasingly aware that Hitler's ambitions were much larger than many leaders had originally hoped. Britain and France eventually gave Poland security guarantees. The situation was becoming extremely dangerous. Then, in August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union unexpectedly signed a non-aggression agreement known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, Germany and the Soviet Union promised not to attack each other. Secret arrangements also divided parts of Eastern Europe into areas of influence. Hitler now believed he could attack Poland without immediately fighting the Soviet Union. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later. World War II in Europe had begun. German forces used a combination of aircraft, tanks, artillery, and rapidly moving ground troops to overwhelm Poland. The country was attacked from the west by Germany and later from the east by the Soviet Union. Poland was defeated and divided between the two powers. The conflict that Hitler had helped create was now expanding rapidly. In 1940, German forces attacked Denmark and Norway and then launched a massive offensive through Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. The speed of the German advance shocked Europe. France, one of Europe's major military powers, was defeated within weeks. Paris fell, and France signed an armistice in June 1940. Hitler had achieved a series of extraordinary military victories, but Britain remained. German aircraft attempted to gain control of the skies over Britain during the Battle of Britain. The British Royal Air Force resisted, and Germany failed to achieve the air superiority required for an invasion. It was an important setback. Hitler's attention then shifted increasingly toward Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. It was one of the largest military operations in history. German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, capturing huge areas and millions of prisoners. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. The distances were enormous, resistance was fierce, and the German army eventually faced increasingly difficult conditions. The war in the East became a brutal conflict in which civilians suffered on an enormous scale. Nazi racial ideology also shaped the way the war was conducted. Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, people with disabilities, and many other groups were targeted for persecution and murder. What had begun with discrimination and exclusion was developing into systematic mass killing. By 1941 and 1942, the Nazi regime was carrying out the Holocaust, the systematic murder of approximately 6 million European Jews. Ghettos, mass shootings, deportations, concentration camps, and extermination camps became part of a continent-wide system of persecution and murder. This was one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Hitler's government was responsible for a vast system of state-sponsored terror and genocide. But while the Nazi regime was carrying out these crimes, the military situation was beginning to turn against Germany. The war had expanded far beyond the conflict Hitler had originally originally imagined. Britain remained unconquered. The Soviet Union was resisting, and after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States entered the war against the Axis powers. Germany soon declared war on the United States. Hitler was now facing a coalition containing some of the world's greatest industrial and military powers. The balance of the war was beginning to change. By the beginning of 1942, Germany was fighting a war on an enormous scale, and Hitler's decisions were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The German army had advanced deep into the Soviet Union, but the invasion had failed to destroy Soviet resistance. The winter was brutal. Supply lines were stretched across enormous distances, and German troops were facing an enemy with vast reserves of soldiers and resources. Hitler increasingly interfered directly in military decisions, refusing to allow commanders to retreat even when their positions became extremely dangerous. One of the most important turning points came at Stalingrad. German forces entered the city in 1942, expecting to capture it and secure an important strategic position. Instead, the battle became a devastating struggle for every street and building. Soviet forces eventually surrounded the German Sixth Army. Hitler refused to allow the trapped troops to withdraw. By early 1943, the German forces at Stalingrad were defeated. Around 90,000 German soldiers surrendered, although many would later die in Soviet captivity. The defeat destroyed the image of German military invincibility and became a major psychological turning point in the war. Meanwhile, the Allies were becoming stronger. American factories were producing enormous quantities of aircraft, tanks, ships, vehicles, weapons, and supplies. Britain remained a powerful base for Allied operations, while Soviet forces were increasingly pushing German troops westward. Germany was now fighting a war it could no longer easily control. In North Africa, Allied forces defeated German and Italian troops. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. Mussolini's government collapsed, and Italy eventually changed sides. German forces occupied much of Italy and continued fighting there, but the Axis position was weakening. The greatest blow came in June 1944. On June 6, Allied forces landed in Normandy, France, in what became known as D-Day. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops eventually entered Western Europe. They established a major front against Germany while the Soviet Union continued its enormous offensive from the east. Hitler's Germany was now being attacked from both directions, yet Hitler refused to accept that the war was being lost. He continued ordering counterattacks even when Germany lacked the resources needed for them. In December 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, known as the Battle of the Bulge. At first, German forces achieved surprise and pushed through Allied lines, but the offensive eventually failed. Germany no longer had enough fuel, aircraft, soldiers, or industrial capacity to sustain such operations. By early 1945, Allied forces were entering Germany itself. Soviet troops were approaching Berlin from the east, while American and British forces advanced from the west. German cities had been devastated by years of bombing and warfare. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died, and Europe was exhausted. Inside Germany, the reality of defeat was becoming impossible to hide. Hitler moved into the Führerbunker beneath Berlin. The man who had once addressed enormous crowds and presented himself as the leader who would create a powerful new Germany was now living underground as enemy forces surrounded the capital. During these final weeks, Hitler remained convinced that Germany should continue fighting. He issued orders to military units that often no longer had the ability to carry them out. His world had become increasingly disconnected from reality. At the same time, The full scale of Nazi crimes was becoming visible as Allied forces liberated concentration camps. Soldiers and journalists discovered starving prisoners, mass graves, crematoriums, and evidence of systematic murder. The world was confronted with the horrific consequences of Nazi racial ideology and the Holocaust. The Holocaust had not been an accidental consequence of the war. It had developed from years of anti-Semitic propaganda, discriminatory laws, forced removal, deportation, mass shootings, and eventually systematic extermination. Approximately 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Millions of other people were also persecuted and killed by the Nazi regime. As Soviet forces fought their way into Berlin, Hitler's final days were approaching. On April 29, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun inside the bunker. The following day, April 30th, Soviet forces were fighting only a short distance from the bunker. Hitler and Braun died together inside the Führer bunker. Their deaths marked the end of Hitler's personal rule, although fighting in Europe continued for several more days. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Hitler's 12 years in power had left Germany and much of Europe devastated. Cities had been destroyed, economies were shattered, millions of soldiers had died, and civilians across the continent had suffered unimaginable losses. World War II in Europe had resulted in tens of millions of deaths, but the consequences went far beyond the battlefield. Germany was divided and occupied by the victorious Allied powers. Europe entered a completely different political era. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers, beginning the period that became known as the Cold War. The crimes of Nazi Germany also became central to the post-war international legal system. Nazi leaders were prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials, where the world confronted questions about responsibility for aggressive war, mass murder, and crimes against humanity. Hitler's story is therefore not simply the story of a dictator who lost a war. It is a warning about how democratic institutions can become vulnerable when societies are overwhelmed by fear, economic crisis, political division, propaganda, and hatred. His rise did not happen in a single day. He began as an obscure political figure in a country struggling after World War I. He learned how to exploit public anger and political instability. He built a movement around extreme nationalism and racial hatred. He used propaganda to create an image of strength and national revival. Once he gained power, he destroyed democratic opposition and transformed Germany into a dictatorship. And then he used that power to pursue territorial expansion and an ideological war that caused unprecedented destruction. One of the most important lessons from this period is that historical events are rarely caused by one decision alone. Hitler was responsible for enormous crimes and catastrophic decisions, but his rise also depended on institutions, political figures, economic conditions, supporters, collaborators, and millions of people living through a period of extreme uncertainty. That does not reduce Hitler's responsibility. Instead, it helps explain how such a destructive regime was able to gain and maintain power. Today, Hitler remains one of the most studied and condemned figures in modern history. His name is inseparable from Nazi Germany, World War II, and the Holocaust. But remembering this history is not about glorifying the man or treating his rise as a story of success. It is about understanding how propaganda can manipulate people, how hatred can become government policy, how democratic institutions can be weakened, and how political extremism can lead to consequences far beyond what ordinary people initially imagine. Adolf Hitler's life ended in a bunker beneath a destroyed Berlin, but the consequences of his decisions continued for generations. His rise began during a period of national frustration and political instability. His dictatorship turned Germany into a state built around control, persecution, and war, and his pursuit of racial and territorial domination helped create one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. The story of Adolf Hitler is therefore not just the story of one man. It is a story about power, propaganda, ideology, war, and the catastrophic human cost of allowing hatred and dictatorship to become stronger than the institutions designed to restrain them. And that is why this chapter of history continues to matter.